Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch our event, to join us here tonight on such short notice. We really appreciate Dr. Bill Wohlforth joining us on, again, such short notice. It's a great thing that we have this opportunity to talk with him. Before we get started, though, a few things to mention. My name is Tim Horgan. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is dedicated to helping people better understand what's going on in the world. This is a perfect opportunity for us to utilize these virtual tools to help our audiences better understand what's going on in Ukraine in a rapidly changing situation. Having said that, we are a nonpartisan organization. We do not take any stances on policies, politics, candidates, etc. And so the views and opinions expressed here tonight are those of the speaker. We view ourselves as the platform for discussion, and we hope that you take the information presented here tonight to better understand and to formulate your own opinions on what is going on. I'll quickly mention a special thank you to Southern New Hampshire University for being our mission partner for these programs. We really appreciate their support, as well as the support we receive from our members, donors, and board. Without your help, we would not be able to do these great programs, and we hope that you continue to enjoy them. If you're not yet a member, we would appreciate you considering joining as a member and helping to support these great programs. All right, since we have about half an hour, I wanted to end my comments there and bring Bill on. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us here today. And I think if you could give just a little bit of background on the Daniel Webster Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. You've been there since 2000, and you've got a specialty in international relations with some focus on Russian foreign policy. But what is sort of your wider background, and how have you been watching the unfolding events here in Ukraine and Russia?
I could say quickly that my entire professional experience is in some ways bookended by major events involving Moscow/Russia/Soviet Union in the United States and the world. I got my start in the Cold War, but the first major event of my professional career was the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, then celebrated as a remarkably peaceful ending of that generation-long conflict. And now we see a conflict that has arisen in part by an attempt by Russia to reverse parts of that Cold War settlement, bringing back into play many of the issues that I've spent my career studying: great power politics, foreign policy, in particular Russian foreign policy, Soviet foreign policy. The only other thing I will add to this is that I have extensive experience sort of traveling and interacting with my colleagues in Russia. I do not want to present myself on this program as a expert and a subject expert on Ukraine and Ukrainian politics. And Ukraine is the tragic victim of events, and it is an important player. Its people, its government, its elites is a key player in this event. So just to put that caveat across, that expertise on Ukraine is far more scarce than expertise on Russia.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that should be considered in this. We certainly are looking at this from a very Russia-U.S. With Ukraine sort of being a key player, of course, but someone that this is more of happening to in the geopolitical space. So, of course, we woke up this morning to reports of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there's been talk for the past several weeks, if not months, of whether or not Russia was going to invade Ukraine. Can you give us a little bit of background for those who may not have heard as to what the issue at stake here is? Why is Russia doing this? What sort of led up to this decision to finally invade after saying that they had no plans to invade?
That's a very, I hate to say it, a complex question, in part because the Russian authorities, from the President Putin on down, have put so many different things on the table. you can pick out of the official statements of Russian officials a large number of potential problems that Russia has with the status quo in Europe and in Ukraine, and you can pull out of that different stories about what the specific issues are. But formally, the Russian government has said from very, very early on, but especially since 2007, that it is very strongly opposed to the existence within Europe of a singular security system based on NATO under the auspices of American leadership that has no role in it for Russia. And especially it is opposed to the extension of this US-dominated system to its neighbor, Ukraine. And beginning in spring of 2021, but then ramping up in the fall and over the winter of this last year and into 2022, Russia built up a very powerful military force around Ukraine. It accompanied that buildup with a series of demands or requests, conditions that it really wanted to have attention paid to. Some of these involved revising the security structure of Europe, the rules in which by which European security is going to be conducted, in a sense to pull NATO deployments back to before where they were deployed in 1997. It also wanted a ironclad pledge that Ukraine would never be a member of NATO. And finally, it wanted a resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, which was occasioned by the change in government in Ukraine in 2014 and Russia's intervention in Ukraine in 2014. That complex of three issues were at the forefront of Russian demands. The United States, Ukraine, and Europe responded with some offers to negotiate some things, but rejected some of the fundamental demands by Russia. At the end of the day, Putin gave a big speech in which he expressed a number of grievances, which sounded very much like he questioned the very legitimacy of Ukraine as an independent state and certainly questioned the legitimacy of its current government. And at that point, the rest of the world sort of woke up and saw that we have on our hands a militarized crisis that is highly likely to result in war. Finally, the penultimate event was yesterday when the UN Security Council was meeting to consider this issue. As that council was speaking, President Putin gave a speech that announced his so-called special military operation in Ukraine, which looks to be a major military operation whose ultimate objective is not 100% clear, but seems to have as his objective, if you read what President Putin is saying, a regime change in Ukraine.
Yeah, so pretty serious issues at stake here. And one of the things that I've been wondering as I've read over the past couple of months about what's going on, it seemed like Putin had some pretty strong demands that the West was never going to be willing to agree to. So do you think that this was something that was in the cards all along? Do you think that there was room for negotiation, or was Putin just sort of stringing the world along here?
Vladimir Putin himself sort of, in his really extraordinary speech on Monday, kind of undercut the argument that there was a bargain, in that the speech was very, it didn't express a lot of bargaining space. It didn't express a lot of room for a deal. It seemed as if the Russian leadership under President Putin had given up on the idea of any kind of real bargain. And if you read that speech, it seemed as if they had sort of settled upon the only way that they were going to reach their political objective, which is to keep Ukraine from ever becoming a part of the economic and security West, that the only way to achieve that objective would be this massive use of force. So I used to think that there was a potential bargain, and many diplomats earnestly worked on it at all three levels that the Russians put on the table: the level of European security, the level of Ukraine's membership of NATO, and the level of the settlement of the Ukraine, the internal situation in Ukraine, which was largely fomented by Russia. At all three levels, one could imagine bargains. But right now, it seems as if Russia had given up on the idea of this kind of diplomacy some time ago, and it was just putting in place the necessary pieces for what it thought would be a military solution to its problem.
Okay, and so we see now that Russia has invaded. Putin recently admitted to or acknowledged that troops have been sent in. You mentioned regime change seems to be one of the goals. What do you think the overall goal of this action is? What is Putin looking to do? And particularly, why now? You know, the idea that NATO has been expanding. Well, they haven't expanded in the past 6 months. They haven't expanded in the past year. So where do you see this as basically the why now to what we're seeing?
Well, I will give an answer as best I can, not being privy to Kremlin conversations. And it's important before I answer your question to say that to explain behavior is not to excuse it or even defend it. My job as a analyst is to try to understand it. And I think to do with that proviso in mind, the question of why now, I think the best answer, based on observable evidence, the best answer is that President Putin thought that the West was taking Ukraine away, that the West, the EU and the United States were slowly and consistently and steadfastly and unremittingly working to pull Ukraine into the Western sphere, both economic and military, where NATO expansion itself was only part of the issue. Putin in his speeches refers to military integration of Ukraine within NATO. So for him, the issue became not just NATO in Ukraine in NATO, but NATO in Ukraine. So essentially, the fear was that they were losing their avowed objective of preventing what they would think of as the alienation of Russia from Ukraine. So that's the background, is a sense of loss, a sense of trying to not lose, rather than a sense of ambitiously conquering the rest of Europe. The second piece of the story, why now, is Russia tried all kinds of other ways of achieving this objective of preventing the alienation of Ukraine, and they all failed. Their intervention, the seizure of Crimea, their intervention in the eastern region of the Donbass, their use of economic pressure, their use of cyber attacks, their meddling in Ukrainian domestic politics, all of that wasn't working. And then essentially, I believe the evidence by their comments and speeches suggests that the Russian leadership just gave up on any possible negotiation with the government of President Zelensky. Zelensky came into office a Russian speaker, sort of standing for better relations with Russia, but over time, again, this is from the Moscow view, he sort of was pulled west to the point that he became, they said, they think, an unreliable, untrustworthy interlocutor for Russia. So the result, well, and then Zelensky started moving against domestic opponents who he thought were closely tied to Russia. So the argument here is that Russia is seeing all of its ways of influencing things in Ukraine failing. So then it built up this military force and basically said to the West, to the US, to Paris, to London, you are the supporters of the Ukrainian government. You are Zelensky supporters. I want you to put pressure on Zelensky to agree to what I want in Ukraine. And the West refused to do this. And so he ultimately felt that his only option was to use military force. Once again, I am not excusing or even suggesting that this is a sound strategy, but it's the best approximation. That explains why now and not earlier. The failure of non-military means to achieve his objectives. The final point here is that the timing seemed auspicious on some counts. Number one, he has China at his back, helping him out with any sanctions that may come. Number two, energy markets put Russia in a very relatively favorable position when it comes to a battle over sanctions. And finally, he has built up a nest egg of a gigantic foreign currency reserve of some $600+ billion that allows Russia to weather the expected, anticipated, intense sanctions. And so the result of all of this helps us to understand why there was this sense of urgency to move now and not later, but also why they didn't move before, when they thought that perhaps these non-military levers could work.
And as you mentioned, they've tried a number of different options. This is a long-going operation by Russia to try and stop Ukraine from moving westward. Can you talk a little bit about why is Ukraine so important and so vital in Russia's opinion of their security interests?
There's at least two answers to that. Well, actually, there's three, I should say. Sorry to be professorial on you. There's sort of three answers to that. One answer that is often mentioned is that that Putin fears a democratic Ukraine, as it would present an image of a closely a country close culturally and geographically to Russia that had become a flourishing democracy and therefore would inspire domestic opponents within Russia. So that's one reason why some people think that Putin, in particular, the Russian leadership, is especially kind of neuralgic about Ukraine's geopolitical and political orientation. A second reason is actual fear of the security consequences to Russia of Ukraine's military cooperation with NATO. Putin in his speeches refers to various and sundry weapon systems that he thinks are being potentially contemplated to be deployed in Ukraine. They have very short flight times to Russia. Overall, just this idea that if Ukraine becomes a military outpost of the main geopolitical rival, the United States, that is very, very bad for Russian security. Here, most Russian analysts would point out things like the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States itself would hardly look with equanimity at Russia or China creating a military alliance with, say, Mexico and deploying weapons in Mexico. So here the argument that Ukraine is important to Russia for pretty traditional, standard, great power reasons. So that's reason number two why Ukraine looms so large. And the third is this emotion or sentiment about the close connection between Russia and Ukraine that Putin constantly refers to. Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukrainian people, most of them, reject this vision that Ukraine and Russia are really in some sense the same or so closely tied that they're essentially, they have a shared history. And so, but again, this is a reason that some people cite why Putin is so neuralgic over the alienation of Ukraine is its precise closeness. The argument here is he wouldn't think necessarily the same about other post-Soviet states, for example, the Baltic states, as he does about Ukraine because of this close, what he sees as this kind of imperial vision of the closeness of these two peoples. Allow me to stress that this third reason, this sort of particular sense of connection between the two peoples, that somehow it's felt more acutely if you lose Ukraine than if you lose other territories that used to be part of the Russian Empire. I mean, this is hugely and vociferously rejected by scholars of Ukraine and Ukrainian history. So that's just it's a lightning rod, but nonetheless, some analysts see it as one reason why the reaction to Ukraine's geopolitical orientation looms so large in the Russian worldview.
You mentioned earlier that you think, or signs point to this being targeted for regime change in Ukraine. But we see boots on the ground. We see fighting in different areas and Russian troops taking over land in Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not there are signals or signs? And of course, we can't divine the future and know what people are thinking, but where is the analysts thinking on where this ends? Does this end with an occupation of Ukraine? Does this end with a regime change and then Russia leaves? Or as John Smith sends in, does this stop with Ukraine or move on to other former Soviet areas in which they may want to take back?
Let me start with the last one first. Pretty much everything I've said so far has suggested a very strongly sort of Ukraine focus, a strong Ukraine focus in Putin's objectives right now. I just heard an interview with the Prime Minister of Estonia. Certainly, we consider a vulnerable country. She doesn't see a threat to a NATO country from Russia in the near to medium term as something we need to worry about. So the focus now is on Ukraine. Where does this go? I read vociferously people who are extraordinarily good military analysts, many with their own military experience. Some of these analysts combine both extensive actual military experience with deep area knowledge, Russian language skills, and so forth. I mean, basically what they will tell you is that once you get into a war, you know, it's the realm of deep uncertainty. It's so hard to know what is going to happen. Most of them would say that a conventional force-on-force battle, the Russian military will dominate the Ukrainian military. So that's something that people can look at and kind of estimate. What your question is about, though, is what happens after that. What happens after the in these sort of conventional matchups? The Russians emerge victorious on the conventional battlefield and in the skies. Then what? And nobody knows. Nobody knows. I mean, we know that we can infer just from basically rational inference, and also from what they've said, the Russians very much hope not to have to occupy the country, because they know then that they may face an insurgency. And in an urban setting, an insurgency can be a very, very nasty thing. We can go on about what Russia might do and what kind of force it might be willing to exert if it's facing such an insurgency, but nobody knows where that develops. And so that's why, to get back to the very first part of your question, that people assume, again, this is simply based on the intelligence that's been leaked and by what Russian leaders have said, including Putin saying he's going to demilitarize and, he said, denazify the regime, the Ukrainian government. If you infer from this, though, that for Russia to achieve its political objectives, it is hard to see how they do that without the installation of a compliant regime in Kiev. And it's most people who are familiar with modern Ukraine, which has turned very much towards the West, just don't see how the Russians could pull off such a regime change smoothly. And so there's a lot of skepticism about Moscow's ability to do this thing. But it seems logical in this situation and consistent with behavior so far that that's what they kind of think they want to do. They want to find a Ukrainian partner with which they can make deals.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about how we got to this point, what's going on. I'd like to talk now a little bit about the world's response. So Russia's allies are all for this, it sounds like, although China is in a bit of an interesting box, having been so forthright about non-intervention. But the world, the Western world, we'll say, is leaning heavily into the sanctions idea. President Biden spoke to the nation today saying that sanctions were never designed to stop this action. It was designed to punish and make things hard on Russia for any action that they did take. Can you talk a little bit about what that world reaction looks like? Do you think it will be effective to simply take these sanction steps, and what are the end goals of these sanctions?
Well, the goal, as far as I can infer from President Biden's speeches and others, is to impose such costs on Russia that essentially it gives up. I mean, it teaches a lesson. The maximal goal is that Russia sort of rethinks its objectives in Ukraine and settles for something less than these maximal objectives of utter, transformation of Ukraine into a, Belarus-like client state of Russia, or at least a state that is reliably oriented towards Russia and never going to become part of the West. So if Russia is put through such economic hardship that this becomes untenable, the hope is maybe they would settle for something less than that maximal objective with respect to Ukraine. But if failing that outcome of the sanctions, it would be at the very least to weaken Russia to the point that it would never contemplate any further move, and sort of inculcate a lesson that this kind of behavior is so costly and so painful that any other state, be it Russia or anybody, that thinks that you can use force to change borders, to go up against what America likes to call the rules-based order, which says you don't attack sovereign countries and take bits of territory from them, that any other country that might contemplate such a thing will look at Russia and say, That's not a road I want to go down to. That's not a road I want to go down. That's extremely costly. Your question is sort of also kind of getting at gaming out or estimating sort of how this all would work, the battle of sanctions between the West and Russia. And that I just have no idea. The only thing I would put is no one will know until, unfortunately, to the great pain of many people, both in Russia and in the West, until we test out who actually is willing to suffer the most under these sanctions. And if we go with the maximal sanctions that President Biden announced, and if they are adopted by other multilateral players, including Europe, my guess is Russia will respond very, very dramatically. And those responses could include cyber attacks. Again, Biden said if that's the Russian response, that we have a counter. But I start to worry about the escalation inherent in that cyber conflict. And then there's the possibility that Russia will itself embargo items of extreme importance to the rest of the world. That includes not only its energy, but it includes its wheat. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I think it's the biggest wheat exporter right now. That includes various key inputs to everything from aircraft to microchips. So we could get into a sanctions war whose outcome is very difficult to predict. I can't forecast where it goes. The only thing I can do is sort of counter easy, relaxed feeling that somehow, because Russia's economy is so much smaller and so dependent on natural resources, that somehow Russia will be easy to bring to its knees. That I do not think is true. It's sitting on $640 billion in foreign currency reserves that it can use to keep its economy going. It seems to have China at its back, and it has ways of punishing the West back. We will see in coming weeks how united this sanctions coalition actually is, who defects from it, and who sticks with it. And doubtless Putin is betting on divisions emerging as soon as the cost starts to be felt by populations in Europe and the United States. So all bets are off there, and we will have to see.
It's been really interesting to watch how sanctions have been implemented against Russia for Crimea, for their recognition of the Donbas regions as being independent more recently, and yet he continues to move forward with these efforts to bring Ukraine under their sort of sphere of influence, we'll call it. So I want to, as we have a few minutes left here, I want to sort of focus in on this idea of splitting NATO, of finding those areas, those touch points where they can peel people off in the sanctions regime. I saw a poll today done by the AP from a few weeks ago. Only 26% of Americans say that the U.S. should be majorly involved in this conflict. 52% say that we should play a minor role in it. Do you think Americans, and I'm not sure what the polls in Europe say, but I would imagine they're somewhat similar, although maybe higher because it's a more closely felt invasion. Do you think there is long-term interest in maintaining the sanctions regime?
The answer is that we will only know going, as I just said, it's the reason you have battles like this is because each side can tell itself a story that it's going to win and the other will back down. And with the current information we now have, we can't know who's right until it's tested. But I will say polling and careful research, including by one of my colleagues here, Steve Brooks, shows that the thing to think about with Europe is not so much the polling in this or that country, but the diversity of strategic perspectives or perceptions in the capitals across NATO. If you're sitting in Madrid, or you're sitting in Lisbon, or you're even sitting in Athens or Rome, the stuff that's going on up in Central Europe is a long way from your immediate concerns. And we've already heard statements coming from some of these southern tier NATO countries that sound like questioning the degree to which they are willing to inflict pain on their people on behalf of punishing Russia for what it's done in Ukraine. Versus if you are in Poland or you're in the Baltic states, things look critical and extremely important. And you're going to see a test of how long this unity can be sustained. The critical country here, which many people have focused on, of course, is Germany. And for the moment, Germany seems to be on board with a lot of these sanctions, Germany being the number one economic power within the European Union and very influential within that union. So again, I just can't forecast. What I know is that the world looks very differently from the different capitals of Europe, and the Russian strategists would hope to play upon that dissension in an attempt to begin to put cracks and then widen those cracks in any sanctions regime.
All right, we're right at 30 minutes, but if you have time for one more quick question, although may not be that quick of a question, just wondering, in terms of looking at this as a whole, Russia is claiming that this is a problem because NATO has expanded beyond maybe where there was a confusion on whether or not they would expand 1 inch westward or not, or eastward, sorry. So do you think that this is a problem caused by NATO expansion, or is this a problem caused by Vladimir Putin and his sort of worldview?
You know, I'm sorry that I have to say both. I mean, I would love to say it's only NATO expansion. I think I actually am among those who still thinks that if you were to wind back the clock far enough and redo a policy that was a little bit more willing to dial back the NATO expansion dialogue, you might have well back. This was apparently not something that would have worked once we had this huge. I think once you had 170,000 troops around Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear that alone would not have satisfied Putin. In fact, I listened to his speech on Monday, and he basically said that President Macron of France, had mentioned the idea of a long moratorium on NATO expansion, and he called that just a trap for Russia. So if you get us all the way up to 2021, 2022, I don't think so. But if you wind the clock back to 2007, 2008, when this decision was made by the NATO alliance at the Bucharest summit, that there was not a question of whether, but when NATO was going to go to Georgia and Ukraine. If we had begun to respond and hear the Russian concerns back then, attempt to help Ukraine as much as possible economically, democratically, in every other respect, but somehow early on create clarity that NATO expansion to Ukraine wasn't in the cards. Who knows? If you rewind history to that degree, you may well possibly have reduced the sense of anger, resentment, the sense of critical need to revise its position in Europe that you now see in Moscow. But to absolve the Russians of the responsibility for this is completely impossible. They've invaded a sovereign country with a gigantic military force. I mean, come on, they're the main actor here. That is, and no amount of regret over possibly how the West has tried to woo Ukraine, it can take out of the picture the fact that a preponderance of Ukrainians wanted to move west. It wasn't something that was just what the United States and its European allies were doing. In some sense, the United States and its allies, yes, were sort of working with Ukrainian civil society to build democracy, but a lot of the impulse was coming from Ukrainians. And Russia's own policy through seizing and annexing Crimea illegally, and through then intervening in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, pushed Ukrainian population even more westward. So I think if you had to allocate responsibility for this terrible tragedy, you would have to give the current political leadership of Russia, and especially Vladimir Putin, most of the responsibility for it.
Yeah, of course, there are no easy or clear-cut answers in any of this. So, Professor, I know you've had a very busy day today. I appreciate you carving out some time for us. I hope that this resolves peacefully in the near future, although the possibility of that is maybe pretty low. But thank you so much for taking the time today to talk with us and to answer some critical questions for our audience.
Thank you. It was a great conversation, although on a very sad topic.